Chapter 90 Rest Time, Part 2, Cabbage. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Here's the stuff for the week. Count it if you want to make sure nothing's missing. Wuba pulled out his notebook and started jotting down the details with his charcoal pencil. As the guy keeping track on the ground, he couldn't afford to be sloppy. If he was, City Hall would waste a ton of time trying to sort things out. He'd even made a waterproof fur pouch to protect his notes from getting soaked with sweat or anything else. If it all looks good, I'll help you get it inside. The priestess stood on her toes, eyeing the supplies piled up halfway to her height. She tried to compare it to the usual amount, but gave up. Even if the lords around here are greedy, they always get the numbers right. She'd had a rough start, unable to offer any of the paid services she usually did. Turns out, the lords were all broke. She nodded, and Wuba began unloading the sacks from the cart, one by one. These bags, made by the tailor shop, were only recently becoming popular. Being able to sew thick cloth into bags made hauling stuff way easier. The tailor shop was using its extra production to make these big, useful bags for everyone. Let me try. Ugh, that the priestess grabbed a sack of husked rice from the cart. Her green robe trembled as she strained, managing to lift it only a few inches. Heh. Wuba, watching her struggle, chuckled. Just leave it, priestess, I'll carry it. You're too skinny to be lifting a sack that weighs like 40 pounds. Wuba easily hoisted the rice sack off the cart, then grabbed two smaller bags and handed them to her. Here's the dried meat, and here's the salt. That should be enough for the week. Wuba carefully counted everything. At the end of the cart were two saplings, their roots wrapped in cloth to keep them from drying out. These are the saplings you wanted. They were a pain to find. Thank you, that the priestess's eyes lit up. She'd mentioned it to Wuba when he brought her food last time, and he'd actually remembered. Hey, priestess, mind if I hang out here for a bit? Don't call me priestess, call me Leah. She pouted, shaking her fist. You never remember my name. The church is open to everyone. Wuba, trying to hide his embarrassment, followed Leah into the church. She seemed pretty happy to see him. The church was decent-sized, with rows of wooden benches, but no statue at the front. Wuba had asked Leah about that. She'd said she only brought one statue, and the one outside was enough. The goddess was everywhere, so you didn't need to be facing her in the hall to hear her teachings. So, Leah, is there anything you need here? Wuba explained, seeing her confused look. I'm doing a survey for the neighborhood watch. We're asking for suggestions on how to improve things and what information people need to provide. He'd realized he hadn't checked in with the church yet. Wuba's eyes flickered to the priestess's face, then quickly away. Her delicate features glowed in the dim light, and her soft eyebrows were clearly visible. Her black hair moved slightly. Noticing him, the priestess brushed her hair back and met his eyes. They both looked away, probably best not to say anything. Well, I'm pretty happy here. Leah's legs swung back and forth, her cheeks flushed, and she made a sprouting gesture with her hands. Like a plant just coming up through the water, full of life and reaching for the sky. The goddess of life loves plants like that. If you could help me get a canal to the back, that would be great. It's a pain to haul water every time. The priests of the goddess of life had special ways to purify water. It wasn't healing magic, but it refreshed people and tasted like spring water. After working, people liked to rest and drink here, so, the farmers had put dozens of benches in front of the church. They weren't particularly religious, but they saw the church as a good place to take a break. As for preaching, the priestess spent her time providing water for the farmers, not lecturing them. She didn't have the energy to explain doctrine to people who could barely read. A canal? Yeah, I can help you with that when I have some free time. Wuba made a note in his book. Anything else? Don't worry about taking up my time. The Lord gave us a day off. I was free, and I remembered the supplies hadn't been delivered yet, so I came here. Wuba sat on the bench outside and unfolded a letter from his notebook. It was more like a note. He'd gotten it when he left the guard post. To keep it dry, he'd put it in the leather pouch with his notebook. The letter was simple: but the handwriting was like a beginner's. It thanked the guards for saving his kid, who had crawled out on the roof for fun. Wuba remembered getting slightly hurt trying to catch the kid. Leah sat next to Wuba, and he didn't hide the letter. Leah remembered the first time she explained the goddess's teachings to Wubai. He sat underneath and listened to her sermon quietly. If the goddess of destiny can guarantee that no one will be hungry, then I will believe it. He replied. Wubai turned to a blank page, and charcoal fell on the paper. Are you going to draw? Leah leaned in, surprised. Yeah, it's beautiful here. Wubai looked out at the fields. The afternoon sun was strong, no one was working, and the fields were so clean that there was only crops left. He spoke softly, and Leah listened. Actually, my family says I'm a pretty good artist. If things go well, I might become a painter someday. Wubai showed Leah the sketch he was working on. The lines were simple, showing the hills, with black and white in layers, and the waves of wheat were described layer by layer. The light technique he used was outstanding. The strokes captured the scene. Wubai stared at the green wheat waving in the distance, while Leah sat next to him, slightly closer, quietly enjoying the afternoon sunshine. Chapter 91 Rest Time, Part 3, Tran. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Only Ji Lin and Su Xiao made the trip. Ji Lin was going for work, while Su Xiao was there to recruit students, a way to bring in extra cash for their territory. Leaving their territory wasn't cheap, costing a minimum of 100 gold per trip, with no limit. The fee was based on distance. Ji Lin instructed Su Xiao to charge 200 gold for each trip. Thank goodness the system included round trips, or he'd be in the red and never leave the territory. He increasingly suspected their post station was really a teleportation anchor, with a asterisk. Whoosh asterisk, it could whisk him from his territory to city-states he'd never even heard of. How many students they managed to recruit would determine the tuition they could rake in for the spring semester. Though, if he did the math right, it was also about time for fall enrollment. Chong Xiao had already compiled a list of needed professionals for the territory and handed it over. Luckily, they had magical backpack space, so they didn't need to lug around gold. Ji Lin grabbed his clothes and left the territory with the dean. After all, he'd barely stepped foot outside his territory before. Other people usually handled purchasing duties. He knew a bit about internal development, but his communication skills were lacking. It felt like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. Many lords had tried grilling visitors about their journeys. Tourist-trap cities always had a ton of visitors from other city-states. These visitors thought they'd had a normal, long journey, but if you asked them to describe the scenery, they couldn't recall specifics. It was even weirder for the lord's hero units. They'd blink, and suddenly be at the station. They didn't even have time for a snack. This trip would also inform future city planning. After all, he had ambitions for a city of millions, a city of millions. Welcome to the holy city of Tran. Ji Lin nodded, saluted the guard, and slid the gold across the table. The guard quickly processed his entry. Before Ji Lin could even settle in, he was cleared to enter. Ordinary people were lined up behind him. Okay, now what? Standing on the bustling street, the lord pondered. Multi-story apartments with brownish tile facades, fancy carriages pulled by all sorts of creatures, well-dressed people chatting on the sidewalks. Shops lined the street, from jewelry stores to clothing boutiques. Everyone seemed used to seeing visitors like Ji Lin in strange clothes, prosperous and orderly, a testament to advanced tech. Thanks to the system, he understood everything they were saying. Just everyday stuff. For the first time, he felt totally lost. What was he supposed to do? Blow through the territory's resources and party every night like those other lords on the forum? That sounded fun, but not for him. Many lords visited these advanced cities, then went back to their fledgling towns feeling discouraged. It was like going from a high-end shopping district back to a dusty small town. If he was going to build up his territory, he'd do it his way. If he was going to take down an enemy, he'd give it his all. Su had taken the member list from Ji Lin. He was doing his job as a deputy, following instructions. Ji Lin wasn't worried. If the dean said he could handle it, he would. As for the details, Ji Lin could just get a summary later. He wasn't at the point where his subordinates had to file a report for every little thing. Too much hassle for everyone. He decided to take a stroll through this impressive city. The cities run by the system were often more unique and cultured than those built by lords, and housed way more people than a lord of the same level could manage. They had their own history and culture. But the history and culture of the lords came from a different place altogether. Lin headed toward the city center. A towering church with rings of white and gold flags, a gleaming spire bathed in sunlight, a goddess statue at the very top. The heart of the city, like Rome in Europe. All roads led to the grand church, impressive, even spectacular, but first, he needed to eat. The bland food back in the territory was making him, a foodie, lose his mind. Even if he tried to spice things up, he was still limited by the lack of ingredients. Being in the city was great. The food scene was thriving, and he could introduce new dishes to the territory later. He could buy seeds and plant them, drastically improving the limited side dish situation back home. He wasn't worried about finding his hero units. They had a special way of sensing each other's location. Chapter 92 Break Time, 4. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Su Shan donned a brand new suit, brushed it off, and topped it with stylish glasses and a felt hat. He looked every bit the proper gentleman. Clothing makes a statement. A sharp outfit could significantly boost his success rate. As dean, he couldn't exactly hit the streets handing out flyers like some common recruiter, nor could he just drop letters in mailboxes and wait for replies. The first was too low rent. Wealthy families would sniff at the sales pitch. The second was slow and meant figuring out the kids' ages one by one. For poorer prospects, Su Shan could bring anyone he deemed valuable back to the territory for education. The territory's income could easily support a few dozen students. But the rich? He'd take them all, tailoring training plans to their parents' wallets. The question was, where could he find a bunch of suitable students quickly? Schools, of course, but classes were already in session. He decided to check the local paper, hoping for information. Maybe he could jumpstart his recruiting plan. Bingo, the town was holding a holy celebration in a week. All young adults would be at the central church for their initiation ceremony under God's watchful eye. The ceremony meant tons of temporary shops and stalls. Perfect. Besides the city-state's obvious attractions, Su Shan needed to scope out what was beneath the surface. Lin gave him 2,000 gold units, a fortune, a third of the territory's monthly output. He was carrying it all. With that kind of seed money, he could make a killing. He swore it on his mathematical prowess. Meanwhile, Lin ran into a problem. Maybe his clothes were too flashy. He was only 2 hours into his walk to the church, and the city was vast with churches spread out. A priest in a white uniform invited him to visit City Hall. Lin wanted to refuse. He preferred to be proactive. But they say the host makes the guest, and the priest's attitude was spot on, even friendly, as if trying to please him. It was a pain. He had no idea what they wanted, and he hadn't even grabbed a bite to eat yet. Lin followed him into the city's municipal center. Compared to the opulent church, this marble-clad building looked austere. It was clean and quiet. The city hall was sparsely furnished. The priest brought him a cup of warm milk tea. The air filled with the tempting aroma of milk and tea. He took a sip, savoring the rich sugar and milky flavor he hadn't tasted in ages. It was smoother and richer than modern milk tea. "May I see your medal?" The Lord's medal was the system-generated badge for each of them when the exercise battlefield began. Besides identification, the medal was for showing to the natives so they could understand the Lord's territories. The natives didn't have the same convenient system as the Lords, whose hero units had an incomplete information system to help them. "Sure." Lin showed him his green medal with the crossbow, spear, and wheat cross. The male priest left, replaced by a young, beautiful female priest. She wore a light white and gold-trimmed dress from the Church of Light, with a small shawl of the same color. Elegant and gentle, she had long hair neatly combed down her back. She greeted Lin with a slight bow and sat across from him. "We'd like to offer you property in the holy city of Tran, with all its revenue yours. In exchange, the Church of Light hopes to build a church in your territory, perhaps with some additional buildings." A wolf in sheep's clothing, Lin knew what they were after. Any other lord, faced with such generous aid, would jump at the chance. A piece of prime real estate in the city in exchange for a useless patch of land in their territory. Lin had already taken plenty of resources from the battlefield and didn't need to swap risks for rewards right now. I'll think about it. He smiled and nodded politely, turning them down. The territory is still developing, and we have personnel needs to consider. The priestess wasn't deterred and kept talking. We also provide low-interest loans to assist in construction and support repayment in the form of real estate, if you need it. If you like Tran, you can stay here long-term. We offer numerous discounts to outsiders. In a different world, a different person sat across from him, using the same tactics and rhetoric. Lin almost thought he was in a bank, with a loan officer pitching him a deal. The light-colored figure caught his eye, and slightly pointed ears snapped him back to reality. He quickly changed the subject. Are there any elves here? That the loan officer maintained her etiquette and explained. The holy city welcomes all races. There are streets and shops built by elves in each urban area. Then Lin picked up his milk tea and drained the last sip. The sugar at the bottom made it intensely sweet. Sugar always gave you a boost. She's been here several times, hoping to get land for a forest. The city has gold and soil, but no location to offer her. We have no current plans. As she spoke, Lin saw the elf he'd noticed earlier, walking out of another door, a hint of frustration on her face. She might have overheard the conversation. Sorry, I have other things to do. I'll be going. He excused himself, turning away from the sales pitch and almost fleeing the city hall. He had never dealt with anything like this before. If he had realized how troublesome this was, he would have left sooner, but the milk tea was great. He could make some when animal husbandry in his territory improved. The trip wasn't a total loss. He scanned the crowd for the elf. Today's update is a little late, so there is no next update. I'm stuck. Anyway, I still owe 2 more updates. Window_tabula equals window_tabula_tabula.push, mode, thumbs, feed, 01, container, tabula below article feed, placement, below article feed, target_type, mix. Chapter 93 Rest Time, v. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The priest and his 2 guards stood before her, a hint of arrogance on his face. The 2 soldiers in white armor behind him were expressionless, but the glowing blue talismans on their armor showed they were ready for action. Miss, have you considered our offer from last time? That the elf eyed the unwelcome guest warily, as if he was about to snatch something from her. How annoying. I don't want to hear that proposal again. Please leave. Having dismissed the bothersome priests, the elf turned and spotted Lin standing a short distance away. How about we find a place to sit down and talk? Lin suggested. After a moment's hesitation, the elf agreed. She noticed the medal displayed on Lin's chest, the symbol of a lord. He'd shown it to the priests and hadn't put it away. They randomly chose a cake shop. It was mostly empty, just them and the manager, who was carefully setting up decorations for a celebration in the corner. A gramophone played slow, melodic music. Magic and spells never failed to create amazing things. Lin ordered every pastry in the shop, filling the table. The elf felt flattered, while Lin just figured he'd be stuffed if he ate any less. What was that proposal they were talking about? Lin asked, curious. To give them saplings to turn into magical instruments and use as gifts during the celebration, the elf replied, annoyed. Celebration? Every year on the 2nd Thursday of June, Tran holds a week-long holy celebration. Leaders from each parish present valuable treasures to the cardinal's administrators to prove their loyalty and competence. It's next week. The elf huffed. Except for those annoying priests, I actually enjoy it. The sapling, there's a story there. Tell me everything. The elf gently blew on the warm tea in front of her. A metal fork danced in her hand, speared a strawberry, and delivered it to her mouth. A long time ago, there was a giant tree that took root in this massive tree. Its enormous canopy protected countless creatures. Under its protection, light flourished, existing forever, and could even reach the stars. No monster, no matter how strong, could escape its protection. Then, creatures tried everything to save it. Some left with its remaining seeds, while others abandoned the gift of the trees and built their own civilizations in the barren world. My parents only took one large sapling, saying it was a piece of their homeland's past. A hint of confusion clouded the elf's eyes. She seemed to have forgotten many details. She was still young. These stories, passed down through generations, had become hazy and indistinct. They fear the disaster that comes from reaching the stars, but they also covet the power that touching the stars could bring. She seemed to be mocking the Church of Light. Lin's eye twitched slightly, not because of the story, but because of the system message that had popped up after she finished. Exploration mission unlocked. Level 7 foot. Upon acceptance, the item will be added to your inventory. Level 7. That was the same level as his original era. Level 7 represented the atomic information age, the time when they were transported to this world. The lords had progressed from level 1 to level 7 in just 2 years. Compared to 1,000 years, that was only a blink of an eye. In fantasy novel terms, level 7 was practically demigod status. If he could recruit this seemingly easy-to-recruit elf, he could start an exploration mission in a level 7 city. No, she would be a huge help in the future. He was going to get this elf on his team. So, how about joining my team? Lin asked sincerely. Huh? Oh. Well. The elf was flustered. But I've almost saved enough to buy a plot of land. I was just at City Hall to check the price. It's pretty big enough for me to plant it. Then I'll take care of it slowly, make some money, and see if I can get it to grow. The elf quietly outlined her plan. If you join my territory, you can plant trees there. There's plenty of land for your sapling. And if you need different soil, I can help you find the right kind. Lin turned on the charm, perhaps moved by Lin's genuine enthusiasm. The elf nodded eagerly in agreement. Chapter 94 Rest Time, 6. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Edited content. So, when do we leave? Miss Elf perked right up, ready to go. Out of curiosity, why not go to other city-states? She just pursed her lips and shook her head. He glanced down at the wooden table, then heard her soft voice. Lots of people want that tree relic. They want it as raw material for staves, research material, everyone's after it. The Holy City has enough discipline and order to keep them operating within the rules. This city, old-fashioned and rigid, still clings to teachings from thousands of years ago, unchanged by time. That's why she chose to live here and buy a place. No matter how bad the harassment gets, they can't extend their reach into another parish, compared to city-states ruled by kings, or those that would do anything to her. She's always hidden herself, protecting her people, so, why should she trust Lin? Maybe it's because he can't beat her, and she can leave any time. Besides, that tree doesn't grow just anywhere. Plant it in a barren world, and nothing happens. The elves don't even know where it does grow. Tran wasn't ideal, but Miss Elf had noticed the first leaves sprouting. Finally, she could give it a try. Worth it. Miss Elf nodded to herself. Okay, I'm heading back in a week. I want to stay here for a bit. Lin stirred his milk tea in the white porcelain cup, the spoon swirling through the white liquid. Enough sugar is always tempting. Fructose, lactose. He cut off a piece of cream cake, topped with silky, fragrant white cream. It was soft, sweet, and melted in his mouth. No fast food in this era. The aristocracy mostly bought pastries. The city wasn't focused on technology, but had worked hard on culture and food. The taste was way better than the vegetable oil cakes he was used to. Delicious. Lin watched the street outside. Pedestrians in classical outfits strolled by, mostly in white and gold, the Illuminati's colors. Many adults in the Holy City were believers, followed by those in light brown and gray-black. Living like this was pretty nice. Sounds like you've been here a while, Miss Elf. Lin refocused and watched as Miss Elf, keeping up appearances, stuffed pastries into her mouth. Ugh, that she opened her mouth, choked, and scanned the table. She'd already finished her milk tea. This table of treats cost her a month's salary. Never felt so good, buying them. She'd eaten so much, and he didn't even flinch when paying. Let her eat her fill. Ji Lin pushed his freshly made milk tea towards her. If I stay here for a week, any recommendations for a place to stay? Well, sir. If you want to live in Tran, my place is cheap. One meal covers a month's rent. Miss Elf nodded, knowing just the spot, a pretty good place. Excuse me, could I get 2 more of these snacks? Actually, make it 3. Ji Lin looked up to ask the owner to pack some to take back for dinner. If Su Shan didn't find a place to stay, she could live next to him, he could share some with his subordinates. They probably hadn't had cream cake like this. Unbeknownst to Ji Lin, the owner was standing at the door, wrinkled face beaming. A beautiful girl in an exquisite priest's outfit stood there. Her flowing silver hair shone in the sunlight. A soft white hat partially covered her beautiful face, a little cold and expressionless. Golden lines formed mysterious fractal patterns on her pure white robe and skirt, more gorgeous and elaborate than any priest he'd seen. The long robe, her shoulders slumped over hers. Before she'd even stepped inside, the landlady, over 50, left her wooden bench and rushed to greet her. Chapter 95 Rest Time, 7. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Ji Lin was still at his table, swirling a fresh cup of milk tea, watching the milky white spiral form. At this rate, his daily sugar intake would skyrocket. Scientists recommend around 30 to 40 grams of sugar a day. With all the sweets he was devouring, he was practically on the verge of high blood sugar. A little extra wouldn't hurt, as long as his overall intake stayed within the recommended range. High blood sugar was a problem for another day. Right now, he needed to diffuse the awkwardness. Across from him sat a poised woman with platinum hair. Her soft dress rose and fell gently with each breath, and her eyes held a hint of curiosity as they rested on Ji Lin. She was studying this traveler from another world. From the moment she'd watched him enter, Ji Lin knew this was going to be a long, strange day. A new, more elaborate selection of pastries adorned the table. The decorations and latte art showed meticulous attention to detail. Her presence was powerful. Even seated, her aura exerted an almost tangible pressure. Being in the same room as a senior priest wasn't exactly relaxing. The elf lady had bolted the moment she saw her, only waiting for Ji Lin's nod before running off to wait for him elsewhere. Ji Lin didn't mind. He sat quietly, savoring his rare moment of peace and tea. When social situations got tough, focusing on the food was always a solid choice. No one's aura could intimidate a hardened officer, especially one who had stared death in the face. What he didn't know was, priests often had their quirks. Even bound by rules, they had their own little habits. This pastry shop, located away from the city hall, was a frequent haunt of a senior priest. That's why Ji Lin and his team had found it deserted. The shop reserved it specifically for her during these hours. Senior priests always had their time. During that time, the shop's traffic was deliberately reduced to accommodate them. It was the unspoken rule. The consistent patronage of a senior priest brought significant financial and reputational benefits to the shop owner, and no one saw anything wrong with it. On the contrary, it was a sign of prestige. As they say, don't judge a book by its cover. An empty shop might just be waiting for its VIP. In a way, his familiarity with local customs had backfired. Alicia. Alicia smiled, gracefully tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. That's my name. Ji Lin looked up, cut a piece of cake with his silver fork, and popped it into his mouth. Ji Lin. The flavors were even more intricate and layered. The shop owner was truly talented. Ji, like the monsoon. Lin, like the forest. Her voice was soft, like the first breath of spring. Mr. Ji Lin, what are your thoughts on God? That he suddenly didn't mind being proselytized to by a beautiful woman. Do you believe in the existence of God? Ji Lin tossed the question back at her. Alicia nodded vaguely, her expression returning to its previous composure. She gazed at Ji Lin thoughtfully, awaiting his answer. Yes, I believe in the existence of God. Ji Lin kept his answer short and sweet. He met her gaze, and she tilted her head slightly in response. The pure white shawl swayed with the movement. Priests of the pantheon all wore custom-made robes, personalized to their individual physiques and imbued with specific abilities. Despite her youth, the girl before him already wore such a custom-made priest uniform. He wondered what they would think if they knew their divine magic could be obtained by Lord simply building an altar. Lin kept those thoughts to himself. As the silence stretched, Lin realized he might have made a misstep, had he just killed the conversation. Maybe she was just trying to find a way to connect with him. After a moment, Lin came up with a way to ease the tension and satisfy the priest's apparent curiosity. "Do you like stories?" Alicia nodded. And stories, stories were one thing he wasn't short on. Like the stories he'd shared with Jean, he could offer glimpses into other worlds, other universes. Some of the details were fuzzy, lost to memory, but he could weave them into complete narratives, a collection of tales like The Little Prince. He settled into his seat and began to tell stories, while Alicia sipped her tea and listened attentively. Sometimes, the captivating plots elicited subtle emotional responses from her. Lin wasn't a professional storyteller, but he always seemed to find the right audience. Alicia rested her chin in her hand, watching Lin, who was beginning to tire. He'd slowed down his storytelling an hour earlier. Since then, they'd been enjoying a peaceful, harmonious exchange. The pastries had been devoured long ago. The view outside had shifted from golden clouds to a soft red sunset, until night enveloped the city and the rune-powered lampposts floated to life, illuminating the city protected by the gods. The owner didn't rush them out but quietly turned on the shop's lights, bathing the interior in a warm glow. The pastors of various dioceses strictly forbade them from contacting these outsiders and lords privately, and regarded them as dangerous elements. Their existence itself was regarded as an extreme variable to the world, but they are obviously quite interesting, or, at least, the outsider I met was very interesting. The story he told me was also very interesting. "Thank you, Mr. Lin, for a delightful afternoon tea." Alicia stood and extended her hand, her skirt swirling. "If you have the time, I would like to sincerely invite you to join me at the Holy Day celebration next week." Chapter 96 Rest Time, 8. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Even a city as tightly controlled as the holy city of Tran breeds its share of shady corners. The church cares only about its own religious rules. Gangs fill the void left by the official order. They spread, thrive in the darkness, and create their own networks. They coexist with the church, at least on the surface. The local clergy ignores these gray areas as long as their rules aren't broken. If a gang doesn't cause trouble, the church won't send in the Catholic army. The church tolerates this minor darkness because they have the Catholic army. These loyal soldiers uphold the rules and eliminate any real threats. In the holy city of Tran, gambling exists in a legal limbo, not allowed out in the open. But if it's tucked away in back alleys, the church turns a blind eye. Under the watchful eyes of the church, they cautiously build their operations. Gambling is tolerated, and a cut of the massive profits must be paid to the church as a tithe. All in. The large casino in the central diocese had a unique visitor today. He wore square-framed glasses and gave off an air of quiet elegance, like a scholar fresh from seminary. His plain brown clothes marked him as an outsider. Still, nobody believed a scholar would willingly step into a den like this, and his actions were precise and decisive. All in, pushing all his chips into the pot meant one of two things. Either he was a total maniac, or he already knew he had the winning hand. Su Shan gently shoved his chips forward, a few sliding off the top. To heighten the drama and excite the gamblers, this casino used solid gold chips. The shimmering gold drew everyone's gaze. The dealers looked nervous, but the veteran overseeing the game remained calm. This game wasn't just about money, it was about the casino's reputation. The dealer clutched the cards. The fine paper was creased from his tight grip. Sweat beaded on his brow, dripping onto the dark green felt table and leaving dark splotches. His eyes were bloodshot, and desperation threatened to overwhelm him. "It's 9 now. I've set a deadline of 10 tonight. I need to leave your boss some time," Su Shan said with a smile. "So, I'm all in. Let's finish this quickly." Not everyone was happy about it. Some wanted to resort to force to save face. The man who had been tossed out like trash was proof of what happened to those who broke the rules. According to Tran's laws, they couldn't openly rough up gamblers inside the casino. Hurting the clientele was bad for business. From the moment he walked in, this guy had made it clear he wanted to challenge the owner. "I know your rules. He'd arrived with only 1,000 gold chips, a fortune for the average person, but peanuts in this casino. The waiter politely informed him that he needed at least 5,000 gold chips to face the owner. If he won, he could take the gold or make a request. So, here he was, sitting at the biggest table in the casino. He had defeated 10 players in a row, forcing the casino's ace gambler to come out. Another win would bring his total to 8,000 gold, more than the minimum. If he lost, he'd walk away with nothing. Both sides revealed their hands. The soft piano music filled the casino. The clatter of chips was gone. The air was thick with anticipation as everyone watched the two players. All other games were forgotten. Every eye was fixed on the center table, wondering if this outsider could really force the boss to show his face. A little bigger. Su Shan's hand was only slightly higher than the gambler's. The casino's ace deflated like a punctured balloon and slumped on the brown wooden bench. The piano music resumed after a pause. The beautiful women in fishtail dresses approached the winner, refilled his water glass, and helped the defeated gambler up from his seat. Cheers erupted throughout the casino. Gamblers were always on the side of the challenger. Everyone was amazed by Su Shan's gamble, and they shared in his victory. Bravo! That the old dealer removed his black hat and applauded the game with white-gloved hands. His eyes gleamed like a hawk's, as if he were young again. An outsider. He'd seen outsiders before, show-offs who lacked the skill to back up their boasting. They just threw money around. He found them mildly interesting, but none of them had ever gotten this far. The dealer nodded, sat down, and tipped his hat to the owner. It was like he was the banker now. I'm curious why 10 o'clock. Su Shan smiled and explained, 10 o'clock is bedtime. I haven't been up past 10 in ages. I want to finish this quickly so I can complete the task my commander gave me. That way, I'll be fresh to see the city tomorrow. The boss smiled, turned, and sat down, dividing the table in two. You'll like Tran. It's got a long history. I'm interested in your mission. Win or lose, I'll buy you a drink. They talked as if they were old friends catching up over drinks. This cheap wine won't do for such a distinguished guest. The boss swirled the red wine in his glass and frowned. The waitresses in fishtail dresses cringed. Bring out something from my private collection for our guest. What are we betting on? Chapter 97 Break Time, Part 9. You are listening at novelfull.audio. 21 points. Su Shan waved off the maid and glanced across the hall, bathed in a rosy glow. The atmosphere was electric, reaching a fever pitch, just like gladiators fighting to the death in the Colosseum. High-stakes gambling always draws a crowd, a battle of skill and nerve. The rules of 21 are simple. Using a standard 52-card deck, get as close to 21 as possible without going over. Simple rules, almost purely luck. Seems like all you need to do is see what cards the dealer gives you. But for pros, it's more than just luck. Math and probability don't leave much to chance. Card counting. By tracking the cards played, you can calculate the odds and make informed decisions. If you can remember the cards that have been dealt and crunch the numbers, you can control the game. Dealers often counter card counting by using multiple decks, or only dealing half a deck at a time, discarding the rest to throw off the player's count. When mathematicians combine calculation with a sharp memory, the odds swing in their favor. Add a little luck, and they're unstoppable. That's why Su Shan came to the casino. Maybe at first, it was just to pad Ji Lin's allowance. Now, as dean, he wants to test his limits and see what the outside world has to offer. He's stashed his principal elsewhere. He's not dumb enough to bet it all. Su Shan sat quietly, mentally tracking 12 decks. Since he walked into this casino, no one here can beat him. The gray-haired dealer sat across from him. Waiters had set up a screen to hold back the excited spectators, their blood pumping from the impending showdown. Maids in fishtail gowns circled the table like lotus petals, swapping out the deck. The wine in the fresh glasses was golden, with the aroma of ripe grapes and aged oak. He took a sip. Smooth, sweet, flawless. The dean wasn't a drinker. Alcohol clouded his thinking, bad for work. But this was a little respect for himself. This was definitely a good bottle of wine. An experienced gambler whispered that even though their casino wasn't the best in the holy city, their host was the best of the best. It's been years since anyone had sat across from him. They had an unspoken agreement with the church. Senior priests were banned. not to avoid scandal, but because they won too often, even without magic. If they were allowed to play freely, the tithe would become a 15% tax. Most magic and rune users only have their bloodline to rely on, their intelligence isn't that much higher than average. If they came into the casino overconfident, they'd be eaten alive by the dealer's experience. After 2 rounds, Su Shan's winnings reached 10,000 gold. The dealer remained calm, gesturing to deal again. The coins piled up like a small mountain, enough to make every gambler dream about it. "Hit me," the dean said. "Hit me," said the dealer. "Raise the bet." Su Shan nodded. "Raise," the dealer replied, 3 cards each. If they took another, they could bust. Going over 21, the dealer looked at his 3 cards, 19. He stood pat. Victory was close. If the next card wasn't an ace or a 2, he'd lose. "Hit me." The 4th card was dealt to the dean, and he still hadn't busted. Statistically unlikely. With his first 2 cards totaling 10, there was a good chance the 4th would put him over. "Raise." The dean looked at the dealer, a spark of confidence in his eyes, the moment of truth. Someone was going to lose big, unless the cards were busted. Surrender. Su Shan had a 2 and an 8. If his last 2 cards totaled 10 or 11, he could beat him. The dealer thought. "I fold," the dealer said. The dean flipped his cards, 2, 8, 3, 6, 19 as well. Surrender meant the other player got half the pot. The dean looked around and called over a maid. "What time is it?" There were no clocks in the casino. The waiter leaned in to tell him. The dealer sighed, noticing the deepening lines on his face. The changes time had wrought. This exciting game seemed to bring him back to his youth, filling him with energy, hard to let it go. One last round. He looked at the dean, who was about to leave. All in. 0.20 points. Closer to victory than before, the dealer roared, like a desperate gambler. 21 points. Checkmate. The dean turned over his cards and nodded with a smile. Was it that simple? The dealer looked at the paper Su Shan slipped into his pocket, already filled with writing, numbers of people in different professions, vegetable seeds, various books written on it with charcoal. Seeing the pre-prepared list, he knew the other man had come prepared to win, and he was just a step in the process. "Just help me find the list of professionals. And gather as much of the rest as you can. I'll be back. Take it out of the winnings I left here." Su Shan waved. He wasn't one to kick a man when he was down. As for the gold coins, he only took a portion he considered appropriate. Keep it for now. Maybe his lord could use it. Of course, Su Shan wouldn't give his lord too much gold unless it was a crisis. Too many resources would throw off his resource management. The lord was still in his adjustment period. Too many resources could ruin a territory. The lord needed to stand on his own 2 feet. Chapter 98 Rest Time, 10, updated. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Wow, I've been waiting forever for you to show your face. Miss Elf popped out of who knows where. She was seriously patient, waiting from when I first got there until now, when the city was blanketed in night. Lin wasn't familiar with this city. If Miss Elf hadn't left a house number, who knows how long it would have taken her to find him in this maze of streets. He just found a bookstore with a view of the bakery and half-heartedly flipped through a book, glancing up every so often at the 2 figures in the shop. Their conversation seemed to be dragging on. Miss Elf was determined to make a good first impression on her future boss. A super competent subordinate can be a real headache for their boss. After all, first, she griped about Lin taking so long in the shop, then asked, practically buzzing with excitement. "So, what's it like chatting with the youngest senior priest?" "Senior priest? Oh, you mean Alicia. I bet she's gorgeous and has an amazing presence, right?" Lin paused, thinking. Alicia is the youngest senior priest right now, but she won't officially be one until after the Holy Day celebration. She can't actually teach until she's 18. The elf hummed a few notes and steered him onto the more brightly lit streets of Tran. The city at night showed its true colors, the rising lamplight, the bustling streets, merchants hawking their wares, and carriages rolling by, the city under the night began to reveal its own essence, a glimpse of the prosperity to come. Tran during the day was stately and elegant, but at night, it had a distinctly urban vibe. He'd never seen anything like the heavily armored guards who were now patrolling the streets. They were clad in pure white armor, faces hidden behind square helmets, decorative cloaks flowing behind them, and spears that towered over them. They were basically cops, patrolling and protecting the city. But she's just one step away from being a full-fledged high-ranking priest. You know your stuff, Ji Lin complimented, trying to avoid focusing on her specific identity. Once you start discussing someone's role, it's easy to get sidetracked and lose sight of the actual issues. Damn it. Who knew that sapling staff that the jerk in City Hall wanted to confiscate would probably end up in her hands? The elf lady shook her tiny fist, indignant. I'm not letting anyone else have that sapling. Ji Lin nodded, understanding her firm stance. Following her lead, he realized the elf had been in this city longer and knew its layout far better than he did. He just needed to stick with her. It had been ages since he'd seen such a vibrant night scene. His territory in his previous life was nothing more than a hive city. Machines were piled on top of each other and entrances were packed together, pushing urbanization to its breaking point just for survival and expansion. Toxic gas and sewage choked the lower levels, and the city's production was in freefall. Every policy change only led to even worse production numbers. The downward spiral had already strangled the city. The city was dead. He knew the right path, but he'd also witnessed failure. He bought some barbecue and a local drink for the elf, who was suddenly ravenous. She'd specifically asked for the barbecue. The fatty, greasy skewers were a welcome sight for her growling stomach. Ji Lin couldn't help but ask, I thought all elves were vegetarians. Huh? Where did you get that idea? Only some of the higher-ups still stick to that pure vegetarian thing. The elf lady attacked the skewers of meat, which was of some unknown variety. The various sauces coating it made it even more addictive. It smelled incredible. Too bad he'd already stuffed himself in the bakery, milk, tea and cake while chatting with a pretty girl. He was a little too full. After all, he felt a bit guilty about making her wait so long. He'd been so engrossed in his conversation with Alicia that he'd lost track of time. Time flies when you're having fun. Hey, I'm curious, the elf lady suddenly said, whirling around. Her emerald green eyes fixed on him, the corners of her mouth still smudged with cumin and chili oil. She actually stood up. What did you say? That was a rare sign of respect. A country bumpkin like Ji Lin wouldn't understand. As an elf who'd lived in Tran for years, she'd only seen it once or twice. Nothing much. She invited me to attend a holy day celebration in a week. Ji Lin said, any advice? Oh. And you said yes? Miss Elf dragged out the question, a hint of surprise in her voice. I did. Miss Elf choked. PFF. Ji Lin looked at her, confused, not understanding her reaction. First, would you like to take a look at our propaganda? A hooded youth stepped in front of him and handed out a white poster. Ji Lin glanced up, wondering why there were suddenly so many hooded figures in clothes different from the usual priests on the street. They were just like the hooded man from before, handing out flyers. The uniforms of the Church of Light priests are designed with hoods. Sorry, not interested. Ji Lin stepped aside to avoid him. At first, he thought it was some kind of event, like the flyers handed out by shops to attract customers back on Blue Star, but his instincts as an officer gave him a sense of unease. These hooded people were quickly taken away by the church guardians for disturbing the peace, but the guardians didn't use any violence during the operation. Ji Lin picked up the poster the young man had dropped. It featured a sharp golden arrow superimposed on the most prominent double ring symbol of the Church of Light. Behind it was the statue of the Goddess of Light, her solemn and gentle face radiating divine power. God's footprints are in a higher world. We must move forward. If we stay where we are, we will not find the real miracles. We have been in this unchanging world for thousands of years. Their arrival is God's revelation for us to move forward. It took me a few days to finish this real outline. It should be pretty interesting. I'm sorry that the recent update times have been a bit all over the place. Chapter 99 Break Time, 11. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Forna, back late again. Forna's ear twitched as she called out to the landlady, who was over 50 and peering down from upstairs. Landlady, this is a new friend of mine. Got any spare rooms with a bed ready? Lin followed Forna, the elf lady, through the narrow streets and into an alley lit by glass lamps. Compared to the brightly colored houses and shops on the main street, the buildings in this block were more understated, less flashy. The stone and wooden houses, weathered by time, weren't much fancier than those back in his own territory. You could see decades of rain and wind in the worn edges of the walls and the dark stains on the wooden posts. The only clues that connected them to the buildings outside were the common double-nested rings and the rune lights that occasionally appeared around the edges, emitting a faint, warm yellow glow. It all felt like this was the city's true character. It was surprising she found a place like this. One room, please. Su Shan wasn't looking for her, but with his dean's abilities, Lin wasn't worried. He figured Su Shan could thrive here even seriously injured. That specific dean role was a rare find, so, one room was enough. This isn't a hotel, it's just my place. Cheap rent, by the month. Includes meals. Seeing Lin glance around, Forna, guessing he was wondering if it was a hotel, explained. And the landlady's cooking is amazing. The landlady smiled and led him to a room next to Forna's. The house wasn't large. The landlady lived on the first 2 floors, and the 3rd and 4th floors were for tenants. Actually, just Forna. Now there was Lin, a temporary addition. He expected Forna to take precautions for the sapling, maybe use some kind of magic circle, but she didn't. The tree was just sitting in her bedroom like a regular houseplant. It looked like any other sapling. In fact, it was a sapling. A tiny one, only as thick as your index and middle fingers. Unlike the brown-green bark he'd seen on other saplings, this one was greener. The leaves were lively and curled upwards. No special features were visible. After Forna pledged allegiance, the system popped up an analysis interface, letting him confirm the tree's true nature. The elf hadn't lied. World tree, undetermined branch, seedling. In the right world, it will shine again. Sheltering thousands of spirits, it once touched the stars, but disappeared. It's amazing. My parents say it's been like this for almost 1,000 years. Forna knelt down, gently touching the seedling's leaves and branches, which swayed slightly as if responding. Even 1,000 years is a long time for an elf. Time tends to erode everything, but it hasn't changed at all. Lin's gaze remained fixed on the world tree seedling, the undetermined branch. And in the last few years in the holy city, it grew a full 2 centimeters. As if worried Lin didn't believe her, the elf lady pulled out a ruler with confidence. She showed him a notebook filled with weekly measurements, diligently recorded even though it hadn't grown in years. She was thrilled, thinking she'd finally found suitable soil. She had devoted all her energy just for a piece of land in the holy city. Seeing progress after such a long journey was undoubtedly exciting. All land in the holy city of Tran was considered sacred ground, not easily given to outsiders, but through her efforts, they finally agreed to sell her a small plot of 100 square meters to plant her tree. The price was everything she could earn by sacrificing eating for a decade. Maybe it'll grow in my territory, but he wasn't sure, which was a lie. Lin had no experience cultivating world trees, but he could try. Different branches of the world tree have their own specific needs. If it really wouldn't grow, Lin would pay whatever it took to keep Forna, at least enough for her to buy that land in the holy city, just to keep the exploration mission open. The world tree was just a bonus. The level 1 exploration mission was his real goal, but maybe if a high priest vouched for her, she could buy a bigger plot for less. Lin pondered. Even though the territory was getting richer, resources couldn't be wasted. The infrastructure investment was huge. The stone pavement alone was eating up most of his stone reserves. Back in the room the landlady had prepared, he could tell it had been cleaned while he was with Forna. Fresh bedding, all the dust wiped away except on the windowsill. He washed up, changed clothes, and lay down on the bed. He still felt uneasy. He extended his vacation for another week, until the end of the holy festival. Chongshan said it was fine during a long-distance call. The territory was self-sufficient now, able to run smoothly for a while without constant supervision. he was supposed to meet Alicia at the pastry shop early tomorrow, as planned. Forna said she had work to do, and even though she had the 100 gold from Jilin, she would work persistently to see through the final handover of ownership. He pulled out his pocket watch and watched the long hand slowly turn, the needle tip moving around the edge of the dial. 9:15. He never imagined this top-tier item would become just a simple timepiece, but as a timepiece, it was always accurate. He realized he should buy some clocks for his territory. Right now, they were still using sundials, extremely basic tools that needed sunlight to tell time based on the angle. Sundials were useful during the day, but useless at night. He made a note, set aside some funds to buy a reliable timekeeping device. He wondered if mechanical clocks in the Holy City were expensive. 9.2. Thank you everyone. I am in arrears, thank you.